Hey, this is Homer. Marge is having her sisters over tonight. Oh! And Bart and Lisa still aren't talking to me after I set fire to the TV. Oh, well, I guess I'll grab me a can of Duff. Duff. And listen to the Slick Podcast, keeping it real and always keeping it groovy.
You have tuned in for a Slick Podcast. I'm here to seek the truth. Live from Scotland around the UK. The one and only Slick Podcast. Enjoy the show. Can I ask important questions? No matter how bizarre the truth might be. Tune in for Slick Podcast. Keeping it real, keeping it groovy.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or a very good day to you when and wherever you're listening from. And a very warm welcome to the show. I'm your host, Simon Laurie King. Coming up on today's show, I'm joined by Father Nathan Castle. Father Nathan is a Catholic priest and author of 3 books. And they are And Toto 2, The Wizard of Oz as a Spiritual Adventure, Afterlife Interrupted, Helping Stuck Souls Cross Over, and Afterlife Interrupted Book 2, Helping Stuck Souls Cross Over. As I said, he is a priest and he cares deeply and passionately about his fellow beings. Father Nathan once stated that if you are in this universe, then he would always try to help you, as we are all part of this wondrous creation. Amongst his duties as a priest, he teaches, counsels, and tries as best he can to alleviate suffering wherever he finds it. His duties now include the lost souls that have approached him for help, once having died a traumatic death and now find themselves trapped between the here and the great thereafter. My guest today has spent over 30 years helping those in need of guidance, and sometimes in very unique circumstances. I am really excited to have the opportunity to speak with him. So without further delay, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Father Nathan Castle to the show.
It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Let's get the ball rolling on this one. Father Nathan, before we delve into the work you do with those who are having difficulty passing over to the other side from this life and onto the next, if you wouldn't mind, start off by telling us a little about yourself and your initial journey into the priesthood and the duties that as a priest you currently undertake.
Sure. I'm 65 years old, so I was born in the middle 1950s. I grew up in the U.S. in Southeast Texas. I'm from a very Catholic family. There were 5 kids, and my grandparents lived next door. They were very faithful. My grandmother was kind of a mystic. My parents were both regular in their religious practice. So I grew up in a happy Catholic home. A lot of Catholic people have some, stories to tell of Catholic guilt or anything. I just enjoyed my childhood, and I went through Catholic schools until college, went off to a Presbyterian school, Trinity University in San Antonio. I studied many things, but I ended up kind of focusing on gerontology, the sociology of aging populations, but the social sciences in general, and that social scientific training affects the way that I do this afterlife work. I became a Dominican 41 years ago, I guess almost 42, and have been a priest for 36 years, mostly as a campus minister. I've been at Arizona State University, University of California at Riverside, and Stanford University for much of my career.
And what is it that you, because I understand that you have treated trauma to everyday people anyway. Are you still in the business of that as well as your other?
It's always been an interest of mine that for some people, life has its moments that are absolutely traumatic, violent things or abusive things, moments in the story of a life that disturb and disrupt and have the power to linger and continue to trouble people. and then this ministry to people that died that way came along later. But I always had compassion for people around me and stories in the news where you just see tragic things happen to people, and it's heartbreaking. And I guess I always had a sensitivity in that direction.
You have written 3 books. Forgive me if I don't get them in the right order. Afterlife, Interrupted, Helping Souls Cross Over, and book 2 of the same title. Your 3rd book, and Toto 2, The Wizard of Oz as a Spiritual Adventure. This really did pique my interest also. We are going to be delving into the subject matter of the previous 2 books mentioned, but I'd like you to give us an overview of the comparisons you draw from the 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz, and our journey through this existence we call life. I thought it was quite clever, actually.
Well, that was actually the first of my books. I hadn't known I was going to be an author, but I that book came out in 2011, so 10 years ago now. My interest in the Oz story started in childhood. Did you grow up, Simon, in a household where you could only get a few television stations?
Well, yeah, but television back then was kind of like now. We did have a television briefly, and when it was on, as a 3-man family with my father and my brother, we used to have a look at it. And Wizard of Oz, I mean, it's one of those films you can keep watching and watching and watching. It was way ahead of its time, I think. And the good thing, it had no CGI, so actors had to actually act. Carry on, Father. I just wanted to throw that in.
But yeah, in fact, all the special effects were physical ones. There was no computer graphic. But when I was a child, there were only 3 major television stations, networks, and local affiliates that broadcast their shows. And so that's all the choices that you ever had. And there were no recording devices at the time. You watched a show when it came on, and you couldn't record it. You had to plan your life around it and be in front of the television. So in my childhood, the American television network started replaying the 1939 film, which was already, we considered it an old movie, every year. And they would advertise it for maybe 2 weeks before. And on the playground, everyone talked about where they were going to be when they watched The Wizard of Oz. And people gathered for it. They prepared food. Neighbors came over. It was a communal event to watch that movie. And that's really how it gathered my attention, because I saw that old and young and people from all different ways of life cared about that movie and created a party around it. So it did what I thought the Gospels were supposed to be doing. The stories of, the life of Christ and so on were supposed to galvanize us and bring us together as a unit. And they did in their own way, but not with the enthusiasm that The Wizard of Oz had.
No, it is. Everybody would know the expression. Well, I think anyway, not even just a certain generation, when Dorothy looks at Toto and says, "We're not in Kansas anymore."
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the theme for everyday life. But carry on, please.
Well, I also noticed that the television networks, which are secular in their nature, knew that there was something spiritual about that movie, because they normally played it in the spring around Passover and Easter. It had some sort of appeal to the spirit, even though it's not an explicitly religious movie, but it's dealing with the big circle of life and death and afterlife, I think. We were talking of trauma earlier. If you remember, the reason that Dorothy lands in a different world is she was hit in the head with debris from a tornado.
That's right. She was. Yeah. Then her journey began, and very much the endurance, finding oneself, and she does reminisce, and she misses her home. Though technically her home is where she is in Oz, but the people that are familiar, and when it talks about the yellow brick road, treading the right path, just the analogies go on and on.
They do, and one of them. Are you familiar with the work of Joseph Campbell?
No, I'm afraid I'm not, Father. If you could enlighten us.
Yeah, I'll do it briefly. Joseph Campbell was an American who lived for much of the 20th century. He grew up as a Roman Catholic and was at Mass every day during his teen and young adult years. He was fascinated with stories that people tell that provide meaning and context for life, like origin stories. If as you travel, native peoples in different places have different lore about how their land came to be at all. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have the two stories in our Bible about the 7 days of creation, God saying, "Let there be light," and so on, creating these spaces and then populating them with birds or fish or land animals. And then we have the second story, the Adam and Eve one. They're really two different stories written 500 years apart, but both of them are attempts by the author to describe how we got here, what is this place, and what's our purpose in it. And Joseph Campbell was interested in that on a global scale. So he ended up having really to create a new academic discipline, which was a sort of a mashup, if you will, of anthropology, cultural anthropology, archaeology, mythology. He was interested in the stories people tell. And he found over his life that the more he studied them, the more he kept seeing recurring themes, especially something circular in the stories. If you think of the face of a clock from 12 around down to 6 and back to 12, many of our stories have that feature to them. And there's somewhere in the early part of the story, someone's ordinary life is disrupted and they reluctantly end up in a very new environment. Maybe they sail away, like in the Odyssey, for example, and they create new alliances, come upon some nemesis that wants to undo them somehow, some climactic battle, perhaps at like 6 or 7 o'clock down the dial, some apparent victory. Then at the time you're most exhausted, yet another fight, a final conquest of some kind, a realization that you don't really belong here. It's not your homeland and you must return to the place you came from, crossing back over and ending up in the new place, and what he called greening it, like bringing it some sort of new abundance that's born from your sufferings and struggles. So the Oz story fits that motif.
So do you think it was quite deliberate by the filmmakers to, because the more I think about this, because obviously I was lucky enough for you to agree for an interview, and we spoke briefly last week, and I've been thinking about this film. And do you think it was deliberate by the writers, actually, not the directors, the writers, of certain parallels on a spiritual journey? Because I'll just add before you answer that, Father, that with the path and the previous author you mentioned, do you say Joseph Campbell?
Joseph Campbell, yes.
Yeah.
He didn't write the story.
No. He was merely researching. I mean, if you could name drop a book he's done, but it's basically to me, when I was thinking about the film and things like with the path and everything, it really does hammer home the point, which as a male now in my later years, it's nothing that's worth doing is ever easy. Would you agree with that sort of thing? Maybe one of the things they were putting into it.
Yes, of course. The Oz story was written by L. Frank Baum, B-A-U-M, and it came into print in 1900, so on the cusp of a new century, and a really extraordinary time when you think of all the inventions and changes in the world that were going on around the year 1900, and then what it was going to bring in Europe, consecutive world wars with a depression in between, lots of suffering, lots of trauma. The book was an immediate success. And I think he once said he received that it largely wrote itself. Are you familiar with what some people call a download?
Yes, yeah, definitely, constantly, every single day, Father.
Yeah, people, creative people who make themselves available to bring to the world something new. It's not an uncommon experience. Sometimes athletes call it being in the zone.
Yeah,
where, yes, of course, they're using their skill set that they've trained for, but then something rather mystical enters in, and they feel lifted up and out of themselves as they do their craft.
To a coin a phrase, have the muse come upon you.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. That happened to Frank Baum when he wrote The Wizard of Oz. And then, of course, the screenplay was another team of people, as is always the case with screenplays. The author, he had died well before the movie was done. And in fact, if you study the making of The Wizard of Oz, there's a lot written about it. They were writing the screenplay as they went along. They couldn't agree on what the final version of it was going to be after they'd already begun the filming. So the screenplay follows the book quite a lot, but it also diverges from it, as happens with screenplays.
Because of the characters, and we will move on, but I find this intriguing because the characters as well, looking at the film, a lion that needs courage, a tin man that needs a heart, so emotions, and then obviously Dorothy, I would say, she's really drawing analogies and experience from those two. She has to look after, obviously, her dog, herself, and she's questing. It's almost a pilgrimage, I would say, a pilgrimage.
That's one of the chapters in my book is called Pilgrimage. And I asked the reader, if you were going to set out on a journey that required a great deal of you, what would your end be? What would the point of it be? Where would you go, and why would you go there? What would drive that desire? The other character was the Scarecrow, who believes he has no brain, but all of the characters have the thing that they think they lack utterly. They just need to see it grow, and they need to gain confidence in themselves.
Yeah, it's also, I think it reminds me of getting what we need, but not necessarily, in nearly every the case, of what we want. Two completely different things, one more important than the other, I would say, as in what we need. But as someone personally, as I've told you, sorry, not as I told you, that's rude, as I informed you last week, that I myself, I believe, undertook a pilgrimage with my horse and cart across this fair land of Britain 18 years ago. And for me personally, it was all about the journey, as I believe. I mean, I didn't have ruby slippers, but let me tell you, Father, there was moments which I prayed dearly, because we were nearly wiped out by a lorry, divine intervention. But it was all about the journey, and maybe I can draw parallels with that. Thankfully, there was no wicked witches, but plenty of distractions, as in the flying monkeys. Not that I ever saw flying monkeys, but I would say that's almost like the distraction. It's always good to do the right thing. It's always good to focus on what we have, not what we want. But the distractions are endless in our lives. Would you agree with that part? And we will move on from it.
And in fact, the flying monkeys, which many children found so frightening that they had a hard time watching the movie. Mm-hmm. In the story, they're not evil. They're under a spell, and the Wicked Witch has 3 opportunities to force them to do her bidding.
Okay.
And she has a magic cap, so she can use 3 times, sort of like Aladdin's lamp. And she can compel them to do things against their will 3 times. And in the movie, she's using it for the last time to have them go and capture Dorothy and her companions. So there's a remnant of that in the film, but you'd have to know to look for it. That's a much stronger idea in the book.
I think I'm going to have to read the book, because that's news to me. I didn't realize that they were, well, obviously I haven't even thought about it, but yeah, you say that now, that enchanted monkeys. I mean, if they can fly, then why not? But I didn't realize that they'd been compelled, and I suppose they were innocent in this as well. It really does have a lot of analogies and undertone to general life. What was the thing that really was the eureka moment for you when I mean, have you thought about this all of your life? That, hang on a minute.
No, I can tell you exactly that moment. I remember where I was. I was already in seminary, and I was learning about the New Testament in a way that I thought, why didn't anyone tell me these things earlier? How the gospel stories, there's 4 of them, how they're put together, how they differ, who wrote them, when they wrote them, why they wrote them as they did, and so on. The first of the 4 written, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is Mark. It's very short, and it's a story that's driven by the road to the cross. So the road is a very big thing in that gospel, but it lacks a proper beginning and end. It just starts with Jesus as an adult being baptized. He has all kind of adventures that include at the front end a lot of demons, gathering a crowd and so on, and then moving toward a city of destiny at the end of the road, where he will confront forces that will kill him, but he'll rise. Well, then Matthew came along and took that story and expanded it and put a prologue and an epilogue on the front and back of it. And that's the story. The prologue is the story of the three kings, the wise men bringing gifts, Joseph having all these dreams about the baby being born, and then having to flee into Egypt to run away because the baby's life was threatened. Then at the end of the story, Mark ends with the empty tomb, but little else. And the women at the tomb on Easter morning disobey the young man dressed in white who tells them to go and spread the news. They don't, because they're afraid, and it just ends with disobedience and silence. So Matthew found that just too jolting and added all the stories that we have about Jesus appearing to people and the Great Commission to go out to all the world and tell the good news. So it ends up having this linear story, road toward a big city, but then it has a prologue and an epilogue that brings you full circle. And Jesus descends at the beginning and is born a baby, and then at the end he ascends and returns to the Father. So it's that big circle that Joseph Campbell was talking about.
And Jesus, as I've heard in other casts, appear to people and mean different things to different people. Not as in he is who he is, but it can be many things and into the other life. Can I ask you about that? If you know, I've always thought about the Holy Land. I know we celebrate Christmas and the birth of Christ around the 25th, and if I'm right in saying, was Joseph and Mary, Jesus's parents, taking Jesus to Bethlehem to be registered because of, was it Herod? Was he wanted to know the firstborn children, or I totally got things wrong here?
Well, there's two separate traditions about the birth of Jesus. One of them is in Matthew's gospel and one is in Luke's, and they don't agree. Okay. They really do. They're really separate stories. That's just the nature of storytelling. In the early church, these stories were oral. They were passed along around campfires and such, and eventually they get written down. But he was known in his adult life as Jesus of Nazareth, but there was a prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, and so the writers had an issue how they had to answer that question. If he's Jesus of Nazareth, how did he come to be born in Bethlehem? Matthew answers it by saying they were originally from Bethlehem. The baby was born there, and then this king tried to kill all the children, and they had to run away to Egypt. And when they came back years later, they settled in Nazareth. So
that's what I thought. I thought there was infanticide, I think they call it, but
infanticide, yeah. But that's Matthew. Luke's answer is different. It just is. They don't have to be mushed together. They're just two different answers to the same question. In Luke's gospel, they are from Nazareth originally, but there's an edict about this tax paying that everyone had to be a part of this census, and they had to go to their origin city of their tribe. And so the baby was born while they were on a trip, and the baby was born in Bethlehem. There was no room in the inn. And then after the baby, it was they'd done their business and returned. I just got back from a trip yesterday. So they just got back from a trip and they went back to Nazareth where Jesus was raised. But he was, in that story, rather accidentally born in Bethlehem.
It was the only thing I think of is to do with the globe and the weather as well. Sorry, one of the things I think of, then we'll move on, is that on the 25th of December, I know you have a thing called the aphelion with our northern hemisphere around the 25th. We're further away from that star. we go around. So would the weather have been favorable in Bethlehem around that time, or would it be their summertime? If it had been winter, then would they have really want to have traveled to that sort of time? That's kind of where I was going with this.
Well, I think really it's not so much that. The truth is Jesus was born a peasant, and there were not cameras or reporters making note of this. And so we don't really know when his birthday was. But in the early church, when people began to go out to all the world and tell the good news, one of the things they found was there was a festival of light that happened around the equinox that began the winter. Think of Stonehenge, for example. And all over the world, the Aztecs or the Egyptians or whatnot, lots of them paid attention to the skies and the stars, and many of them, of the celebrations that went on around Yule, a Yule log, Yule fire, were about the dying of the light. And there was a kind of a yearning or asking the sun to come back because we can't live without you. So as the days get the shortest that they in the Northern Hemisphere that they possibly do in that week around Christmas time.
Yeah, I mean, a scientific point of view, we don't know. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, time is just a mechanism to stop everything from happening at the same time. And we, as a species, I think we're on the Julian calendar. Julius Caesar and Emperor Augustus, I believe, added their names, July or Luglio in Italian, maybe Latin, and Augusto. Yeah, there's no account for the sky clock. Anyway, moving on. Father Nathan, let's now talk of your first and second books, subject matter that share the same title, Afterlife Interrupted, Helping Lost Souls Cross Over, which to me are your own chronicles of the relationship between yourself and those you have helped and continue to do so. So could you start off by telling us exactly what it is you do to help those lost souls, and how this, I've chose this word carefully, communion, all started for you.
Okay. The first book, actually, the subtitle of it is called Helping Stuck Souls Cross Over. And in the second book, we called it Afterlife Interrupted, Book 2, Helping Souls Cross Over. And on the cover, we actually drew a line through the word stuck. But circling back around, about 23 years ago, I was already a priest. I'd always had a devotion to what in the Catholic Church is called the Holy Souls. That might include our ancestors who've died, who might not be sainted in the official canonical process of the Church, but we think of them as living in connection with God, in communion with God, but perhaps still needing some sort of polishing up, cleansing. The word purgatory means to purge, means to clean, to cleanse, sometimes to get rid of, as you might purge your attic when it's just too crowded. So to somehow come down to what's simplest, most basic, and true. I had a devotion to the soul, to people who had died from childhood, because my mother taught me to pray for the dead. So you pray for the living and you pray for the dead, and we listed them. We went before I could even do letters. My mother would pray with me at night, and we would give blessings to people, including those who had died. Didn't matter whether they were alive here or not. You could bless them. So I grew up doing that and carried that practice forward. And then as a priest, I did plenty of funerals, and I'd always pray to the deceased and visit with them a little bit before and introduce myself and say, sorry, I didn't get to know you earlier, but I look forward to knowing you later. In the meanwhile, I'm going to do my best to help your grieving loved ones, so on. Anyway, I was on a retreat, giving the retreat, actually, leading it, but it was night. I was asleep, and I had a dream that began with my own material. I was finishing a round of golf because I play golf. I was with a priest friend. We went into the bar, and there was a charity auction going on. And some of the items, donated items, there was a nasty piece of art on the wall. And I said to companion, look at that horrible thing. Who would give that to a charity? And when I focused on it, it moved toward me. It was a piece of framed art, but there was a man on the, what is it? Do you call it a hood? What's the front of a car in Scotland?
Oh, it's the bonnet. There could be a hat as well. That's old-fashioned, or a bonnet, but a bonnet. The bonnet of the car.
I knew it was a different word. In the U.S., it's called the hood. But the hood was up, so the engine was exposed, and he was sitting on the radiator of a car from the late 1950s when the style was to have fins and lots of chrome. And he was seated on it, facing me, and he burst into flames and was screaming. And then it ended. Well, I woke up from it kind of in a fright, saying, wow, whatever that was, that the first part was my dream, but the second part was not. I just received a message. Someone's in trouble. And so I sat up and I said a prayer and spoke to the person in prayer and said, I don't know what I'm to do, but I'll get with a partner in the morning and we'll go into prayer and see what we can do. And my partner had some spiritual gifts, and she said, well, whoever this man is, he really would like to talk to you. Would it be okay if I permitted him to? Because she had that gift. And I'd said protected prayer so that we're not messing with, allowing in demons and such, and said, it's, my sleep is consecrated. My voice is consecrated. If I can help, I will. And it turned out to be a man named Ray, whose story is told at length in the first of the 2 Afterlife interrupted books. He had died violently in a fire. He wasn't in a crash. He was in an accidental fire of some kind that happened while he was seated on the hood of the engine of a car. And he came through and explained what he was upset about. And we helped him make a plan for doing what he felt he needed to do and come to peace.
Now, Ray, as I remember rightly, was a very angry young man. And the story I've heard you talk about him before, you did have great patience with him because he was almost, he almost had no time for God. Could you just go into that for me, please?
Well, he had patience with us too, because there's a first time for everything, I suppose. You had a first podcast once upon a time.
True.
We all, there's a first time for everything. And we had never been asked to do this before, but we just said our prayers and asked the Holy Spirit to lead us and then do what we thought was most practical. So we were able to speak with him, but we don't treat that gift lightly. We don't, it's not an amusement. So it's not about, fortune telling or lottery numbers or any such thing. We were just trying to help him solve the problem. He was angry at God. He said, who the hell does he think he is, taking me just when my life was getting good?
So, sorry, carry on.
Well, he was certainly of the opinion that his violent death in a fire was an act of God. And who the hell does he think he is, taking me just when my life was getting good? So we had to kind of patiently get acquainted. And one of the things we said was, Ray, you've come to us for some purpose. Why are you? We learned that he had died in 1960 when I was 4 years old. And I said, well, what have you done since then? Well, he said, nothing much. I said, well, why now? What's motivating you to be so energized about something? And he said, it's my wife. She's an old woman now and she's dying of cancer, and I want to greet her when she comes, but I can't the way I am. So that was his motive. He had been watching his wife since his death as a 20-year-old, and now 40 years later, she's in her 60s and is dying of cancer, and I want to greet her when she passes, but I can't the way I am. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, very much so. So he wasn't malevolent in any way. He wanted to be benevolent, I suppose, towards his former love of his wife, but he was quite an angry young man. So what was your advice to him, and what was your help?
I don't know who's listening to us as we record this conversation, but surely there are people who are angry, but that doesn't make them bad. Angry people often have a reason for being angry.
Yeah, no, my point is that because this was your first, maybe I should explain that a little bit better. Because this was your first and you'd had that terrifying dream, and you communicated with this angry young man, but it turned out that his reason for contacting you was for the good of his wife.
Yes.
That's where I was going with this.
Exactly. And he loved his wife and didn't stop loving her. He just felt ripped from her by an accidental death in a fire as a young man. And they had a baby. His child was 1.5 years old. And he just felt his life had been ripped from him and it was God's fault. And I said, well, who taught you that God takes people? And he said, my mom and his pastor. And he told me that. I said, well, how did you know about God at all? So we have to be taught about God. I learned from my mother. How did you learn about God? And he said, from my mother. She used to make me kneel next to the bed and she'd beat me while I said my prayers.
Oh, good.
Well, I said, now you didn't get to be a parent for very long. Your child was 1.5 years old when you died. But can you imagine that you would have done the same, that you would have made your son kneel next to the bed and you would beat him while he prayed? He said, of course not. And I said, well, why did your mother do that? And he said, I don't know. She just did. I said, well, let's slow this down a little bit. Can you imagine another person with the same story whose parent beat them while they prayed might have learned an odd or incorrect thing or two about God? You know? And I said, did anybody ever say something untrue about you, even if they thought it was true? How about you, Simon? Has anybody ever said something about you that wasn't true?
I would imagine so. Yeah, absolutely.
It happens to all of us. And I just said, Ray, do the math. We're small, God's huge. If that happens to you on a small scale, imagine the cosmically huge scale that untrue things get said about God all day, every day. God knows how to deal with that, has done it, all of God's life. So anyway, but he had to be gently kind of disabused from some of these ideas that he had that had him stuck. And he had told us that his wife was dying. And I said, now, Ray, cancer has its own schedule. And you haven't very much to show for 40 years in the afterlife. And you're asking me to help you hurry now to be ready to greet her. And that's going to mean, sort of as a counselor, getting you to move faster than you might want to. But remember, you're the one who asked, and you can stop anytime you please. If you don't like the way we treat you, if you feel too pushed, you need only say so. But you understand, don't you, Simon? On the one hand, he's saying, hurry up. And then, but we're asking him to change very rooted ideas that have been a part of him for decades.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you had to... I suppose it's if somebody's seeking help, it's better to have them come to you rather than you try and get to them, because they're not aware. So he was aware he had a problem. So how did you help this young man get from?
We just helped him challenge his own thinking and say, wait a minute, are you willing? He had a kind of arrogance about him that's not uncommon in young people. I've dealt with young people most of my life, and sometimes when we're young, we arrive at certitudes about life. And as we get a little bit older, we begin to appreciate that life has, there are more than one answer to many questions. And he was very sure of ideas he had formed about life and God and so on. And some of them just needed to be challenged a bit. I'm not about telling people they're wrong, but I am about getting them to challenge presumptions that might be causing them pain.
Now, he was, though he'd passed from this life, he wasn't fully. I have no idea, and I don't want to even think about it, because obviously I'm enjoying my life here. What is on the other side? But he's passed from this life, and he's approached you. To the best of your knowledge, where was he? If his journey wasn't complete, where was he that he needed?
Well, he was at least, his wife moved. I don't know if you know the geography of the states in the United States, but he had died in Georgia, and his wife moved a little bit to the north to the next state up, South Carolina.
No. I mean, his spirit. Where was he speaking to you from? He obviously needed to pass fully into the next life. I mean, I won't use the word purgatory. He was someplace in between. Have you any idea where that was?
Well, he said to us that he kept watch on his wife, who was in South Carolina. So part of his
Right.
consciousness could at least look in on her physical presence in South Carolina. He's also obviously not in his body anymore, and so he's somewhat floating about. I asked him to describe his environment. He said there's not much to it. He hadn't put any effort into creating some sort of afterlife salon. He lived somewhere where he's aware of his wife, and somewhere where he knew very well that he wasn't in a body. So I don't know. We didn't go into that too much because we were focusing on trying to help him solve the problem he presented.
And were you successful in that?
We were over about a month's time. We met with him about 3 weeks in succession anyway, for maybe an hour and a half at a time. But my partner and I were both busy people. Just the fact that you're dealing on this realm doesn't mean that every other responsibility that you have grinds to a halt. You guys just can't postpone the rest of your life and say, I have to talk to this ghost person.
Yeah, true. I mean, I once read, probably one of the most useful things I have ever read. So I won't say this is from me, otherwise it'll be plagiarism. One of the most useful things I've ever read in my life is if you, and I'm going to ask you if this is basically the message you sent to Ray or tried to undertake, was if you don't like your life, then change your thinking. Was it as simple as that, you think?
It was partly that. I said, Ray, you've spent all this time, and it seems to me like you've just beat your head against a wall. You don't have much to show for it at all. So don't, if you want to keep doing that, you don't need our help. You know how to do that already. You're in search of a different way of being, and we're going to propose some alternatives. One of the things I said was, you want movement. You've been in the same place since your death, and you want to move to be able to greet your wife. Don't you think we ought to let you practice on somebody first? Shouldn't we get you moving with somebody else? Doesn't that make sense to you? And he said, yeah, I suppose it does. And I said, well, then can you think of anybody that loved you that died before you did? And I said, what about your dad? You meant your mom beat you while you prayed, so let's leave her to the side for a moment. But what about your dad? You never mentioned him. And he said, well, he died when I was 10. I was kind of afraid of him. I didn't know him very well. He died in the war. And I said, Vietnam? And he said, no, Korea. So I said, well, what if we were to ask him, what if we asked God to send him, and if he's willing to come, what if we asked him to kind of stay close enough to you where you could see him, but not too close to make you uncomfortable? You could have a moment to size him up and decide whether you trusted him. Remember, he's traumatized. And so I just wanted to move slowly. The way you might, have you ever been, you live on a farm, don't you?
Yes.
Have you been around, do you have any of your animals ever been traumatized animals?
Oh, yes, definitely so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like a dog that was, abandoned or something. They're not trustful of the next human that they meet necessarily, but you can gain their trust over time if you're gentle.
Absolutely.
With them.
I used to have a really good friend of mine, Sebastian. A little part of me went when he went. He was a he was a crow that I found on the road, and he'd according to the vet, she said it looks like he's been hit by a car, and then he's been attacked by a cat, and then you picked him up. So that was a really, really bad day. But myself and Sebastian were together for I think just over a year. So yeah, he was one of the bravest beings that I've ever had the privilege to encounter. But yeah, that would be I would point to that for the example, I think.
Well, I have a dog friend whose name is Toto, after the dog in The Wizard of Oz. He's not mine. He belongs to my best friend, but I was just with him this morning, and he absolutely loves me. He just jumps and dances, and he wants nothing more than to cuddle and look at me and so on. He's just a dear. But for a long time, he lived in a crate. He was really in a cage almost all day, and he was set out to eat with large dogs. He's only 7 pounds. He's a little miniature poodle, and he was out with large dogs, and he was afraid of the food dish and the water bowl when I first met him. So I had to teach him how to drink water and how to eat food without being afraid. Anyway, Ray was like that. He had a kind of skittishness about him because he had been through trauma. And so we let him on his own decide whether he wanted to go with his father. But his father did show up and he said, "Look over there." And I said, "Well, I can't see what you're seeing, but you please describe it." He said, "Well, it's my dad." And I said, "Well, how do you know you're not being tricked?" And he said, "Well, he just looks like my dad, and he's come because he was invited." I said, "Okay, well, do you think you feel safe to do some little trip with him?" I said, "Can you think of a time when you and he had a good time together? Because you said you were sort of afraid of him and you didn't know him very well, and he died when you were so young." He said, "Well, one time we went and looked at cars." So it's a counseling technique. When people are negative in their thought, ask them about a happy time. Everybody has happy times, even sad people. And so I did that little counseling trick and said, "Can you think of a happy time with your dad?" And he said, "Yes, we went and looked at cars." So I said, "Well, we're going to go now, but we're going to check in on you very soon. But if you feel safe to go with your dad, you guys go have a little excursion. Remember, we need to get you moving if we're going to help you greet your wife." So that's the way we left it. We came back to him maybe a week later, got a little update. And he said, "Yeah, we went and looked at cars again." I said, "Well, how'd you do that? He died in the early 50s. You died in 60. Did you have to time travel?" And he said, No, we went and looked at the new ones."
We will be right back after this message.
Hi, this is Captain John Marshall from Sunside.com. Tired of living on Earth? Then come join one of our many off-world colonies that are now ready for families and single applicants. Here at Sunside, we've invested over 25 years into space exploration and colonization. Our terraforming fleet has opened up unimaginable new and exciting opportunities for all spacefaring pilgrims. Use the promo code SLICKPODCAST21 to get an out-of-this-world 5% discount on our compulsory off-world training schedule. Sunside.com. Out of this world and on to the next.
Sleep Podcast. The Sleep Podcast. Yeah, it's a Sleep Podcast. Truly unforgettable topic. This is Sleep Podcast.
Oh, wow.
So somewhere on God's green earth, a father and son ghost team, if you will, were on some car lot somewhere in the world looking at the new cars, just as an excuse to be together.
And did this time with his father, I'm guessing it went a long way to heal that misconception of what happened to him and help him move forward in every sense of the word, I suppose.
One of the ways that I think healing of memories happens is you replace, that phrase, "time heals all wounds."
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I believe that, but there is at least the all part. There are some wounds that time might not heal, but I think it's largely true that if you replace sad memories with new happy ones, after a while, the sad ones don't have quite the power or the space in one's imagination that they did after they had to share the space, if you will, with happier things.
Yeah, not to allow the trauma. No matter, I mean, one person's trauma is another person's it's just a bad day, but not to allow that to define one.
I've known a lot of people that had very rugged relationships with their parents, abusive ones or whatever, and who then married someone who was loving and patient. And over time, the childhood didn't go away, but it was replaced by a really loving, stable marriage. And some such people grow up to be very loving, attentive parents to their own children, even though they had such a hard start in life.
Yeah.
You've seen that, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen people, unfortunately, just can't, or don't have the help to move past that trauma. And some people, I wonder how you're able to carry on, but they don't allow it to define them. And that's one of my things. And we'll move on with another question, if you don't mind, Father. It's one of my things with television that it's almost socially acceptable induced trauma with these horrible things. I mean, we don't have a telling. I threw it out years ago. horror films and war films constantly, and I think it's just traumatizing people. But
Yes.
that's my subtly, that's my opinion, Father. That's what I think.
Well, I'm very careful about that kind of input. I don't watch war films anymore. I just have had my fill of that. And
Yeah.
the other ones, I'll watch some of those ones that are sort of Agatha Christie murder mysteries, where it has a kind of a silliness about it. But I won't watch. Halloween is coming, and there's always a new crop of slasher films around demons and murders and stuff. No, I just
I don't get it. I suppose. I mean, one of the things I don't like the taste of is marzipan. I do. Do you know what marzipan is?
It's some sort of confection, isn't it?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's absolutely disgusting. But eaten often enough, I suppose you'd accept it. Same as nefarious horror films and stuff. Anyway, moving on. Father, could you explain who a prayer partner is and what their initial role is?
Well, it was just my impulse. When I had that dream, I woke up and said, first thing I thought of is my friend who had gifts. And I pray with other people all the time. That's not uncommon. And I've had good prayer partners just in my life since I was in college, people with whom to pray out loud, just so that your own, most devout thoughts are not necessarily always privatized. They can be shared with a trusted other person. And so I've had prayer partners my whole life, but with this particular work, my initial prayer partner, who I've described already, we just learned we knew that we wanted to, I went to her because I knew she was a person who could keep confidence of others, who would be respectful. She'd also had a history of trauma of her own, so she wouldn't be amazed or astounded. That's not a good thing when you're dealing with other people. Nobody wants to be the object of another's amazement. I mean, you might want that, you might think it flattering initially, but most of us would rather be respected for who we are rather than be some spectacle. So it needs to be someone who has a good common sense, good head on their shoulder. It has to be someone who's not afraid to deal in this realm, in this material. It might be off-putting to a lot of people. It just sounds too freaky. So it needs to be someone who's a good, compassionate listener, and a prayerful person. Doesn't have to be Christian necessarily. I have one Jewish prayer partner, but needs to be someone who is compassionate and kind and patient. And I start our before we go into this realm at all, I always do protective prayer. I call on Saint Michael the Archangel, he's the patron of police. He's usually depicted in art as a Roman soldier with wings, so with some sort of strength. I go to Saint Benedict, who's often invoked with regard to the dark side. Holy Mary, Saint Dominic, because I'm a Dominican. I just have a whole bunch of angels and saints that I first invite to surround us, kind of encircle us and keep us safe from any interference. And then we go, my prayer partner and I just get to work. I read the dream and I allow the person who brought the story to speak, and we try to listen for how we can help.
I was going to ask you about that, about protection, being a man of God, trying to see the good in everything, or the work of God in everything. How do you protect yourself? I was quite concerned. Well, curious. Yeah, curious. Quite curious.
I start with Saint Michael the Archangel, and I believe that the church is wise in cautioning people about dealing in this realm. On the other hand, I was invited. I was asked, and I'm a priest, and I believe the Lord asked me to do a work that might be uncommon, but there are many uncommon things in the world. And I did it quietly for the longest time. I didn't write about it publicly until I'd been doing it for about 18 years.
Can I ask, what is the opinion of your, I don't know if it's the right word, but what is the opinion of your diocese and fellow priests, as far as you can ascertain? Is there any eyebrow raising or criticism?
Well, I was prepared that there could be, and not very much at all. I go about doing preaching and retreats and things where I'm invited. And I've been disinvited a couple of times from invitations when people learned about this work. But I don't want to go where I'm not wanted, so that's okay. I have a vow of obedience in my Dominican order to my immediate superiors, and we elect our superiors. In fact, the Magna Carta was modeled after the Dominican constitutions, so we can make a claim that we're the world's longest functioning democracy. So we elect our leaders, and the two who have been leaders in leadership in my Western United States province both signed off on the work I'm doing and approved of it. That's really all that I need.
Is it or would it have been only because I know you've dozens and dozens of cases, you've been doing this for years now.
Yeah, is it about 350 going on 400, I think.
Wow. And counting. So is it only adults, or have you had experience with children approaching you from the other side?
It's almost always adults, but not exclusively so. I remember dealing with a 5-year-old who died of abduction. In Scotland, do they use the phrase with children, stranger danger?
I'm not sure. I've heard of that. Maybe it's in America, but the basic undertone, children would be up on that, definitely.
It's challenging because parents want to raise children who are trusting and see the good in others and so on, but at the same time need to be told, don't take candy from a stranger. And sometimes our films for children are very black and white about somebody being good or somebody being bad, where in fact our Catholic teaching is that everyone is made well, even the devil, that God created only good, and that even Satan has good characteristics left. It's just that he's doing his utmost to oppose God and the people of God and all that's good. So it's tricky, but anyway, I guess I have dealt with children once in a while. This one who was abducted and killed came, and he understood that he wasn't supposed to entrust himself to strangers, but there was a gardener who asked him to help load something into the back of a van, sticks, I think, and he thought he was being helpful, and he didn't realize until he couldn't get out of the van that he had gone with a stranger unwillingly, and he died at the stranger's hand. And then when others in the afterlife came to try to help him along, he didn't know them. They were strangers, and he thought, well, I just did the wrong thing by going with a stranger. I'm not going with you people. And so he was sort of stuck. But then eventually he sought us out, and we helped him reason his way toward how he might test the waters a bit. We used the example of putting your toe in the water of a pool to test it. And he said, I remember it so well, you don't have to do just your toe. You could sit on the steps. That's what a 5-year-old came up with. That another way to test the water would be to sit on you know how steps go down into a pool?
Yeah.
And a child might sit on the steps, maybe up to their chest. He said, you could sit on the steps. So we said a prayer and said, okay, well, if you're willing to sit on the steps, we're going to see if somebody would come, and you can decide whether you think they're safe or not. And we said a prayer and asked God to send the right person. And he said he could see a lady, and she was wearing a one-piece and a rubber hat. So a one-piece bathing suit and a bathing cap, like women did in the 40s or 50s. You go to a beach in the US anymore, you don't see that any longer. But she's saying, he said, she's saying that she's my mom's mom's mom. So his great-grandmother in a bathing suit and a bathing cap came for him.
So he was able to go with that person? He was happy that she was all right, and that was basically him fully crossed over.
Well, yes, I just said, and if you if you're not satisfied that you've done the right thing, remember you can't die more than once. That already happened. So, but if you end up in a place you don't want to be, just remember how you got there and come back to where you are, because you know you're safe where you are. You remember the story of Hansel and Gretel?
Yes.
Leaving a trail of breadcrumbs so you could retrace your steps.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I think in that story the birds ate the breadcrumbs. So
yeah, that didn't work out too well. But a good plan, though. It was a good plan.
It was a good plan, and that's the plan I gave him. I just said, if you do decide that you feel safer where you were to begin with, just remember and retrace your steps. But we never heard from him again. I'm quite confident that he was provided for and brought forward, and his mom's mom was the guide.
Father Nathan, as a man of faith and with many years dedicated to doing good works, can you tell me how these incredible interactions have rewarded you within that faith? From an outside view, I would say it could only have laid in stone that which you have always expected as a young boy, but now know as fact, being the man you are today.
Well, I never doubted that there's an afterlife and that I will one day leave my body and move on to a different kind of existence. That's just been something that was taught me young, and I've never found a reason not to believe that. So it's given me more hope and even joy. I'm 65 years old, so I know a lot of people that I've loved to have died, and I don't dread my own death. I just think the present moment is the moment that's most like eternity, and living in the present moment is the way to glorify the Creator and to thrive. You know, it's one thing to have to make some plans, but planning the future is sometimes the present duty. You know, I don't know. I also believe that we're very resilient. That the Christian message, in particular, of death and resurrection, is true, and you can see it in the cycle of life. Just again, you live on a farm, you must see it all the time. That, well, for one thing, shit becomes fertilizer. You know, the thing that was waste for a time ends up being the building blocks of new life. I don't know. I just believe in that circle of life, and that I'm a part of it, and that we're here to help everyone live their life well and to thrive. And this, it's not the only thing I do. I do lots of other things in the course of a day. I'm starting to teach a course on the letters of St. Paul tomorrow. I have lots of activities. This is only one of them, but I'm really honored that I've been invited into this work. I've met the nicest people in the afterlife.
I must admit, I thought to myself when before our interview, even before our initial talk last week, having read up about you and briefly looked at some of the cases, I'm not going to keep asking you about case after case, because I really do want to encourage people to purchase the books and to read for themselves. I think we've done justice to this, because there is so much more to you. But that is us at the top of the hour, and I really enjoyed and very much appreciate the time that you've given us today. Could you please tell us where we can find your website, books? I also know you make nothing personally from any sales of the books. That's to say, you don't have a fancy yacht and like a Ferrari that you've written, but it all goes to a collective, and in turn, this is used wisely. I also know that you and your fellow brothers have taken a vow of poverty. Could you explain that? Not why, but what that means, and also tell us how we can help.
Sure. We just try to live simply, and we share our paychecks, if you will, and give each other an allowance per month. And it costs me in American dollars about $36,000 a year just to pay for my health care, my automobile, some expenses related to my ministry and such. And so they front me that money, and they ask that I earn it back over the course of the year and turn it back into the pot. So the first 36,000 that I raise in a year just goes back into the collective pot, just to pay my bills. I'm going to the grocery store in a little while, and the groceries won't be free. I have to pay for them like anybody else. And then after that, we have a lot of young men studying for brotherhood and priesthood, and they cost in the seminary, it costs about $52,000 a year to feed and educate one of them. And so I set myself an aspirational goal of trying to raise that much in a year, because that's how I got my education. Other people paid for it. So that's how I do that. My website is called Nathan. My name is Nathan, Nathan Castle, Castle, Nathan-Castle.com. And there are icons that would move you over to my YouTube channel, where this interview eventually will land there. You're going to send me some sort of link, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Yeah, I'll post it to my YouTube so people can find it there. And those things get archived, and they have a life of their own after that. And then the books are available on Amazon. All three books are available as paper books, as electronic books to be read on an e-reader, or as audiobooks. Now, the audiobook of the most recent book is finished, and I keep waiting each day, hoping to find that it's gone live. It hasn't quite yet, but it's any day now. So they're also available, in audiobook form. And I and my prayer partners read the stories as we experience them firsthand. And
we're able to donate to your site. And I would just remind the listeners as well that all money's, living expenses, but also to carry on the good works day to day, what yourself and your brethren would do.
I don't do mediumship. I don't help people talk to their deceased loved ones. But I don't mind consulting with people about, the suicides in particular. A lot of people are very torn about thinking about their loved one that's taken their life or died suddenly, tragically. I do I don't do long-term counseling. I'll say to people, I think of myself as the tow truck driver that can pull you out of the ditch and get you on your way. If you need longer term counsel, that's available, but I'm not that man. But I can do a few sessions perhaps to just help you get unstuck.
Yeah, we've gone full circle here you've pulled them out of the ditch, you've set them on the road, and now they need to drive more carefully, be more mindful of this moment.
Something like that. And, we're conducting this over Zoom, and because of the pandemic, so much of my live in-person ministry disappeared because it was just too dangerous to travel and to be together in a room. So now all over the world, people have learned how to use Zoom. So even people that thought they were very computer averse, it's just not difficult. And so I'll use Zoom sometimes to just do little consults with people. I typically don't charge a flat fee, but I ask them if they found it helpful to make some sort of donation if they're able to do so.
I'm sure people would be more than happy to do that.
Even if it's kind of paying it forward so that I'm available for the next person.
Yeah, I would hope if you've enjoyed spending time with us today, Father, you would consider returning on to the show sometime if your schedule allows that.
Let's do it. We packed a lot into a little more than an hour, but sure, I'd be happy. And other than, I did manage to tell those two stories about Ray and then the little child. There are a lot of other ones, and they're illustrative of a lot of things that can be helpful to people. But of course, they can also find them by just reading the books.
Yeah, that's where I'm going with this. Yeah, it would be great to have you back on. Father, I have one final request of you, if you wouldn't mind, and that is, I ask that you give us a prayer for the world, as I'm sure, like myself, the world would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, let me kind of explain my way into how I'll do that. You're familiar, have you seen Catholic people make the sign of the cross?
I have.
Touching our forehead, our heart, and each of our shoulders, and kind of tracing a cross over our body. When I was a child, my mother knew that I loved pirates. And I had a book that had records inside of musical records, and that lived inside of this book. It had a picture of an island with a palm tree and a broken boat and a crab. And then there was a dotted line and an X. And you know about the X?
Yeah. X marks the spot.
It marks the spot of what?
The treasure.
The treasure that's buried.
The treasure that's buried. Yeah.
You can't see it with your eyes, but it's there. Mm-hmm. So my mother taught me that I was making an X over my body because the treasure's buried inside me. And that when I want to talk to my creator, when I want to talk to Jesus, when I want to talk to Mary or any of the saints, that they all live inside of me. And that all I need to do is make the X over the spot and then knock on the door. So I would take my knuckles and knock on my chest and say, hello, I want to talk to you. And then I pray the Christ idea means beloved of God. That's another show if you wanted to talk about that. But it means supremely loved one, that Jesus is the beloved of the Father, and that you and I are his brothers or sisters, and that we're as loved as Jesus. So anyway, I believe God is loving the whole world all the time without exception. So when I say a prayer for the world, it's not sectarian or denominational, it's just love being expressed. So, and I pray for peace in the world so that people get to live their lives without trauma. Wouldn't it be nice if everybody was free of trauma today? Or if they have to endure something very difficult, that they do it with support and grace, that they don't feel isolated, that others are helping them through it. Later, I'm fixing dinner for a man with COVID because he is sick. And so anyway, I pray in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Loving God, we're grateful for this day and the moments of it. We're grateful for the people and the events that have been a part of it already and who will be in the rest of our day today. Please allow us to breathe in your love, magnify it, make it more visible, and share it freely. Give us new energy to face new challenges. Help us to be full of compassion for all those around us, and one day bring us safely full circle home to you. I ask this through Christ the Lord. Amen.
Amen. Father Nathan Castle, thank you.
Thanks for having me. Let's do it again.
And that was the Father Nathan Castle interview. Wow, what an absolutely lovely man. I really enjoyed our time together, and I found his life story fascinating. The work he does in this life and the work for those who he helps in the next. I could have asked far more about the cases that he's written about than I did, but I encourage you to seek out his books and read them for yourselves. This will do far more justice by them than I can, as well as gaining much needed funds that support the Good Father and fellow brethren, all of whom, let's not forget, have taken a vow of poverty, and in this action would greatly help all of their good works collectively. Father Nathan's work with lost souls is only a small part of what he does. He is a priest after all, and as such has many duties dedicated to the helping of so many others in need. So if you consider purchasing his book, or a small donation, if you're able to, that is, I know it would be greatly appreciated. My thanks again to you also, my dear listeners, for attending this cast today. If you enjoyed this interview, like and subscribe also if you'd be so kind, or leave a comment below, or send the show an email, theslkpodcast@gmail.com. Either way, please, keep them kind. You can find us on all the usual podcast platforms, including YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. And so, my friends, it's time for me to go. Until next time, stay safe, be happy. Bye.
Slick Podcast. Keeping it real. And always keeping it groovy.